Lieutenant William Bligh jolted awake to cold steel against his throat. "Make a sound and you die where you lie," whispered Fletcher Christian, the man Bligh had mentored for years. At 35 years old, Bligh had already navigated alongside the legendary Captain Cook and commanded respect throughout the Royal Navy for his brilliant seamanship. But that meant nothing, as he was dragged half-naked from his cabin, surrounded by men with murder in their eyes. "On your knees," Christian ordered, voice trembling with rage. The humiliation burned worse than fear as Bligh knelt on the deck of HMS Bounty that April morning in 1789. His trusted second-in-command had turned the crew against him, and now they were forcing him and 18 loyal sailors into a severely overloaded 23-foot boat. "You'll be dead within a week," Christian said, throwing a meager package of provisions at Bligh's feet, a death sentence barely disguised as mercy. What Christian couldn't have known was that the very qualities that made Bligh so hated, his obsessive precision, unflinching discipline, and relentless drive, would transform this act of betrayal into one of history's most astonishing feats of human survival. This is the horrifying journey of Captain Bligh and his loyal men. April 28, 1789. The HMS Bounty sailed near Tofua in the South Pacific under Lieutenant William Bligh. Months earlier, they had left England with a simple mission: collect breadfruit plants from Tahiti and transport them to the West Indies. Botanical imperialism to feed Britain's plantation slaves more cheaply. The 5 months they spent in Tahiti forever altered the crew. Therefore, many formed deep attachments to the island, its women, and its easy way of life where food grew abundantly, and the concept of naval discipline seemed absurd by comparison. But the Bounty's departure ripped them from this paradise and thrust them back into the brutal reality of 18th century seafaring: 16-hour workdays, public floggings, and the constant threat of fatal accidents or disease. Fletcher Christian, Bligh's 24-year-old second-in-command, had emerged from Tahiti a changed man. Once Bligh's trusted officer, the young aristocrat now nursed a growing hatred for his commander. "I am in hell. I am in hell," Christian had muttered repeatedly in the days before the mutiny, his mental state deteriorating with each passing hour under Bligh's meticulous and cutting command. The Bounty itself was a pressure cooker, 91 feet long, housing 44 men in spaces barely large enough to lie down. The officers' quarters offered little more privacy than the common sailors' hammocks. Every order, every rebuke, every punishment occurred within earshot of the entire crew. "Mr. Christian," Bligh had bellowed just days before the mutiny, "you incompetent thief! Do you conspire with the men to steal from King George himself?" The accusation that Christian had helped sailors steal from the ship's stores struck at the young officer's honor. Therefore, witnesses reported Christian's face drained of color, his hands trembling with humiliation and rage. But more dangerous than his immediate reaction was what followed: a cold, calculating fury that grew with each passing hour. The Royal Navy's punishment system was brutally effective. Between 1700 and 1850, over 1,500 British sailors were flogged to death or died from flogging-related infections. A captain's power was nearly absolute at sea. For mutiny, the penalty wasn't just execution. It was obliteration of one's entire existence. Families of executed mutineers found themselves socially and financially ruined. Every man aboard the Bounty understood that raising a hand against a commanding officer meant crossing a line from which there was no return. The breaking point came at dawn on April 28th. Christian, armed with a bayonet and supported by 24 others, burst into Bligh's cabin and dragged him onto the deck in his nightshirt. The humiliation of being exposed half-naked before the crew was calculated, a deliberate stripping of authority. "For God's sake, Mr. Christian," Bligh shouted. "What is the meaning of this?" Christian pressed cold steel against his former commander's throat. "I've been in hell for months," he hissed, "and you put me there." The mutineers knew their decision was irrevocable. Therefore, they had to ensure Bligh couldn't reach civilization to report them, or they would all hang. But they were divided on how to handle this problem. Some advocated execution, while others couldn't stomach outright murder. Christian's solution was calculated cruelty disguised as mercy. Cast Bligh and any loyalists adrift in the ship's smallest boat, the 23-foot launch, with minimal provisions. In the vastness of the Pacific, far from any European settlement, their deaths would be virtually guaranteed. 18 men declared loyalty to Bligh or were deemed expendable by the mutineers. They were forced into the launch alongside their captain. The mutineers threw in what amounted to a death sentence masquerading as supplies: 150 pounds of bread, a 28-gallon cask of water, a small quantity of rum and wine, 4 cutlasses, and minimal navigational tools, a quadrant and compass. David Nelson, the expedition's botanist, begged to be allowed to take his scientific journals. A mutineer laughed and threw the papers into the sea. "Please," Nelson pleaded. "My life's work. Enough," Christian snapped. "Lower them." The launch dropped into the water, immediately sitting dangerously low, only 7 inches of freeboard separating them from the sea. The boat was rated to carry perhaps half their number safely. With 19 men, it was a floating coffin. As ropes were cast off, Christian looked down from the Bounty's rail. Something like doubt flickered across his face, a momentary recognition of what he had done. Bligh looked up at his former protege. "Mr. Christian," he called, his voice steady despite everything. "You have damned your soul for eternity." The last words from the Bounty as it sailed away came from a mutineer who hadn't lost all humanity. "God help you, Captain Bligh." What no one aboard either vessel could have predicted was that this act of betrayal would set the stage for one of the most extraordinary feats of human endurance ever recorded, and that William Bligh, cast adrift to die, would instead cement his place in history through an achievement that defies belief even today. As the Bounty's sails vanished into the haze, the 19 men sat in stunned silence, the full horror of their situation sinking in like the icy water seeping through the boat's seams. They were floating in nothingness, specks of desperate life in an ocean so vast it consumed the horizon in every direction. The launch sat dangerously low, just inches of wood between them and oblivion. Every small wave sent water sloshing over the sides and around their legs. Every shift of weight made the fragile craft tilt precariously. Hopelessness hung in the air, thick as the salt spray. Therefore, Bligh stood suddenly, his eyes burning with a cold fury that startled the defeated men. "Listen to me," he commanded, voice cutting through their shock. "I will bring you home alive, or I will die in the attempt." But his next words chilled them further. "If we practice perfect discipline, some of us may survive. If we don't, all of us will perish. There is no middle ground." He laid out their only possible path to survival. First, reach the island of Tofua to gather supplies. Then navigate 3,600 miles, a distance wider than the Atlantic Ocean, to reach Timor, the nearest European settlement. Therefore, Bligh established a strict rationing system: 1 ounce of bread and a 1/4 pint of water per man, per day. But these rations were far below what was needed for survival under normal circumstances, let alone for men working continuously to keep their vessel afloat in challenging conditions. The 1 ounce of bread allotted daily to each man contained approximately 80 calories, less than 5% of what an active adult male requires. Modern survival experts estimate that without Bligh's exceptional leadership and rationing system, the crew would have exhausted their supplies within 2 weeks, making their 47-day journey impossible. To maintain order in their cramped quarters, Bligh divided the men into 3 watches. He organized a rotation system where some could attempt to sleep while others bailed water, managed the sail, or kept lookout. Space was so limited that men couldn't stretch out to sleep. They sat shoulder to shoulder, taking turns to shift positions. The physical torment began almost immediately. Within hours, salt water had soaked through their clothing and begun chafing their skin. By the 2nd day, the first blood appeared, seeping through trousers and shirts where skin had rubbed raw. By the 3rd day, They faced their first life or death crisis. The weather turned against them. Black clouds swallowed the horizon. The fragile launch began pitching wildly as waves grew from gentle ripples to towering walls of water. Rain fell in stinging sheets, driven horizontally by howling wind. "Bail or die," Bligh screamed above the storm's rage, his voice barely audible. The men used anything available: cupped hands, shoes, coconut shells, working frantically as water poured in faster than they could expel it. For hours, they fought a losing battle against the sea that sought to claim them. John Fryer, the ship's master, shouted over the wind, "She's going down! We're finished." Therefore, Bligh seized the tiller with one hand and Fryer's shoulder with the other, pulling him close enough to be heard. "While I command this vessel, we do not surrender. Bail." But by morning, they had survived, soaked to the bone, exhausted beyond words, but alive. When weak sunlight broke through the clouds, the men saw Bligh still at the tiller, eyes bloodshot from salt water and sleeplessness. He hadn't moved for 12 hours. They reached Tofua the following day, their small victory providing a dangerous surge of hope. "We'll form parties to gather water and food," Bligh ordered as they approached the island. "But remain vigilant. These natives may be hostile." For 2 days, they cautiously traded with the Tofuans, exchanging buttons and small items from the boat for coconuts and water. The men gorged themselves on fresh food, their bodies craving nutrition. But as darkness fell on their third day, the mood among the islanders shifted imperceptibly. "Sir," whispered William Peckover, the Bounty's gunner, "they're gathering weapons, hundreds of them." John Norton, the quartermaster, a powerfully built man respected by all, positioned himself between the sailors and the growing crowd. The drumming intensified as darkness deepened. Therefore, Bligh ordered an immediate retreat. "Back to the boat, move quietly but quickly." But as they backed toward shore, the first stones flew through the air. "Run," Bligh commanded as the attack escalated. The sailors scrambled toward the launch, stones raining down upon them. Norton stood his ground at the rear, allowing others to reach safety first. "Norton, come now!" Bligh shouted from the boat. As Norton turned to run, a club struck his skull with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the sand as Tofuans swarmed over him. The sailors in the boat watched in horror as he was beaten to death on the shore, his screams abruptly silenced. "Cut the line! Push off!" Bligh ordered, his face ashen but resolute. Therefore, they escaped with their lives, leaving Norton's body behind. But this deadly encounter forced an unthinkable conclusion. They could no longer risk stopping at inhabited islands. As the men watched Tofua recede into darkness, the full implications crashed over them. They would have to survive the entire journey to Timor, over 3,600 nautical miles, on their remaining provisions and whatever rain they could catch. William Cole, who had earlier spoken of death, now looked at Bligh with haunted eyes. "How many of us will see Timor, sir?" Bligh's answer was steel-wrapped in quiet certainty. "Every man who doesn't surrender to despair. I pledge that I will not fail you. We will reach Timor if seamanship can accomplish it." With Norton's death hanging over them like a shroud, their fragile boat turned westward, beginning what would become perhaps the most extraordinary feat of survival in maritime history. Day after day, the small launch crawled westward across the endless blue void. Each sunrise brought the same tortures as the day before. 19 men, crammed so tightly they sat between each other's legs, their bodies stewing in a noxious mixture of seawater, urine, blood, and sweat. The sun flayed exposed skin by day. The wind froze wet bodies by night. Sleep became a memory, a luxury from another life. William Peckover, the aging gunner, began screaming on the 5th day when he removed his salt-encrusted trousers. The skin of his inner thighs came away with the fabric, leaving raw, weeping wounds. But this was merely the opening act of their physical disintegration. "Men," Bligh announced, his voice carrying over the constant groans of suffering, "we are now entering waters no European sailor has properly charted. they had reached what we now know as the eastern edge of the Great Barrier Reef, 1,400 miles of coral daggers waiting to rip open their fragile boat. One navigational error means death for us all. This statement barely captured the enormity of their navigational challenge. Without proper charts, navigating thousands of miles of mostly unknown waters required extraordinary skill. Bligh had only his compass, a quadrant for measuring latitude, and his memory of sailing these waters years earlier with Captain Cook. Navigation in the 18th century relied heavily on latitude measurements, using noon sun observations with a quadrant or sextant. Longitude determination was much more difficult, requiring precise chronometers that were rare and expensive. Bligh's achievement of navigating precisely across thousands of miles without detailed charts or reliable longitude measurements remains one of history's greatest feats of practical navigation. As days turned to weeks, the men's suffering intensified. Their lips cracked from dehydration, their bodies weakened from malnourishment. Each man lost weight dramatically, their uniforms hanging from increasingly skeletal frames. "The pain in my legs is unbearable," one sailor complained as the symptoms of scurvy began to appear. Joint pain, swollen gums, and the reopening of old wounds. Therefore, Bligh ordered that any birds or fish they could catch be consumed immediately for their nutritional value. But these opportunities were rare. On occasion, they managed to catch a seabird that landed on their boat, or gaffed a passing fish, small moments of relief in their ongoing ordeal. The boat itself began to deteriorate. Constant exposure to sun and salt caused the wood to warp and seams to loosen. Therefore, they stuffed cloth into widening gaps to reduce leaking. But this was at best a temporary solution. By the third week, severe weather tested them again. Massive swells threatened to capsize them with each passing wave. "Hold fast! Hold fast!" Bligh shouted above the howling wind as mountainous waves crashed over them. During one particularly violent storm, they were forced to throw overboard some of their already limited supplies to lighten the vessel. Each lost provision represented reduced odds of survival. They bailed frantically throughout the night. By morning, they found themselves still afloat, a minor miracle that boosted their flagging spirits. The psychological toll matched the physical. Tempers flared in the cramped quarters. Despair and hopelessness crept into the men's expressions. Bligh maintained strict discipline, insisting on regular watches and duties to maintain order and purpose. But he also recognized the need for hope. Studies of survival psychology reveal that maintaining a sense of purpose is critical in extreme situations. Bligh's insistence on maintaining naval discipline and routines wasn't just about efficiency. It provided essential psychological structure that kept men focused on living rather than surrendering to despair. "I remind you all that we make good progress," Bligh announced after taking measurements with his quadrant. "We are on course, and I am confident in our navigation." This confidence was tested dramatically as they approached the Great Barrier Reef, a massive coral system stretching more than 1,400 miles along Australia's eastern coast. Without charts, navigating this treacherous barrier represented perhaps their greatest challenge yet. For 3 days, they searched for a safe passage through the reef. Therefore, tensions mounted as provisions dwindled further with each passing hour. But Bligh's experience with Captain Cook proved invaluable. He recognized patterns in the water and bird activity that suggested a navigable channel. "Steady as she goes," Bligh commanded as they threaded their way through coral formations that could rip their fragile boat to pieces in seconds. The passage through the Great Barrier Reef represents one of the most remarkable achievements of the entire journey. With virtually no margin for error, Bligh successfully navigated one of the world's most dangerous marine environments without charts or modern instruments. As they cleared the reef and entered the open waters of the Arafura Sea, their spirits lifted momentarily, but they were now entering the darkest phase of their journey, where life and death would hang in perfect balance. By day 30, hell had many forms. It was the tongues swollen so large they deformed men's faces. It was the stabbing pain of salt-crusted sores that wept clear fluid. It was the mind-shattering headaches from dehydration so severe that urine came out brown when it came at all. "I cannot feel my legs anymore, sir," whispered John Fryer, the ship's master, his once commanding voice now barely a dry rasp. They're just not there." His eyes held the vacant terror of a man feeling death climb through his own body. Bligh gathered what remaining strength he had and crawled to the water cask. His hands shook violently as he measured their remaining supply, but what he found stripped away even his iron composure. Less than 2 days of water remained at their current ration. "We must reduce water to 3 teaspoons per day," he announced, his cracked lips bleeding as he spoke. A low moan rippled through the men, several beginning to weep. This wasn't water restriction, it was a slow execution. Midshipman Hayward's skin had split open along his spine where bone pressed against flesh without the cushion of muscle or fat. The constant salt water turned these wounds into blooming roses of infection. The stench of rotting cloth and festering flesh hung in the still air as their clothes disintegrated on their bodies. Several men were now completely naked, their genitals and buttocks rubbed raw and blistered from sitting in salt water for a month. "The fields! Can't you see the fields?" screamed young Robert Tinkler suddenly, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Water! Trees!" In a surge of manic strength, he lunged toward the gunwale. 2 men grabbed him as he threw himself toward the imaginary paradise, his nails tearing bloody streaks down their arms. "Hold him down," Bligh commanded, his voice carrying the last remnants of naval authority. "Tie him if necessary. No man dies while I still breathe." Bligh dragged himself to the center of the boat, his own body a skeleton draped in loose skin. But what little strength remained in his voice needed to serve them all now. Modern survival experts point to Bligh's psychological approach as particularly advanced for his time. He understood what we now call survival mindset, the critical importance of maintaining hope and purpose by setting small, achievable goals and celebrating minor victories. He kept his men psychologically engaged in their survival. "Tomorrow we will catch rain," Bligh announced with confident authority, despite there being no guarantee of precipitation. "And I believe we are no more than 10 days from Timor, if my calculations are correct." This projection was optimistic, but it gave the men something to cling to, a reason to survive one more day and then another. Day 35 brought their darkest hour. The water was gone. Several men had become so weak they could barely sit upright. Therefore, the stronger sailors supported their weaker companions, helping them take their meager rations. But this shared suffering forged bonds that kept them fighting together. "We die together or survive together," Bligh declared, reinforcing their collective identity. No man is expendable. When a sudden squall appeared on the horizon, it represented their last hope. "Ready the canvas," Bligh ordered. "Every drop is life itself." They spread sheets of canvas to catch the precious rainfall. But the storm passed quickly, providing only enough water to extend their survival by a few more days. As they entered day 40, several men appeared to be at death's door. The carpenter, barely conscious, whispered, "I can go no further, sir." Bligh came to sit beside him, but instead of accepting defeat, he spoke with firm resolve. "You shall see England again," Bligh told him. "I promise you this. Your wife and children are waiting, and I will not tell them I let you surrender." Research on extreme survival situations shows that having a reason to live, particularly family connections, significantly increases survival rates. Bligh intuitively understood this, frequently reminding his men of the families waiting for their return. By day 43, they had been reduced to catching the occasional flying fish that landed in their boat and drinking the blood of seabirds they managed to capture. Their existence had contracted to the most basic struggle for survival, finding just enough sustenance to see another dawn. Each sunrise became a victory in itself, but the physical agony of their condition made each day an exercise in endurance beyond normal human limits. Then on day 45, a sailor pointed weakly toward the horizon. "Land," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Land." At first, Bligh feared this was another hallucination. Therefore, he used his quadrant to verify their position. But the sailor was right. The distant smudge on the horizon was Timor, the Dutch settlement they had fought so desperately to reach. The men tried to cheer, but could only manage weak croaks. They had reached the limit of human endurance. Yet somehow, impossibly, they had survived. June 14th, 1789. 47 days after being cast adrift, time had lost meaning, replaced by an endless cycle of suffering, when a sailor's dry, cracked voice croaked a single word: land. 18 pairs of hollow eyes turned. Some men couldn't even lift their heads. Others wept silently, too dehydrated for proper tears. On the horizon, the smudge of Timor appeared. Salvation after a journey across hell itself. "We've done it," Bligh whispered, his once commanding voice now a thread of sound barely carried on the breeze. His body, once fit and strong, had consumed itself. The skin of his face clung to his skull like wet parchment. "We've survived the unsurvivable." The Dutch colonists at Kupang Harbor ran to the shore as the ghostly vessel approached, but what they saw froze them in horror. They were not men, but animate corpses, wrote Willem Bligh, the Dutch official who witnessed their arrival. Their flesh had vanished, leaving only skin draped over bone. Their eyes sank into dark caverns. That they still drew breath violated all natural law. The 19 men who had been cast adrift had endured one of the most remarkable survival journeys in history. For 47 days, they had navigated 3,618 nautical miles across the open ocean in a severely overloaded boat with minimal provisions. And all but one had survived. The survival statistics of Bligh's journey defy belief. Of the 19 men cast adrift, 18 survived 47 days at sea, a 95% survival rate that shatters all norms. Modern maritime disaster studies show survival rates plummet below 20% after just 1 week in open water. For comparison, the 1719 wreck of the Speedwell left 300 men adrift. Only 24 survived after just 2 weeks. The 1820 sinking of the Essex saw only 8 of 20 men survive a similar journey. Bligh's achievement stands as perhaps the greatest survival story in maritime history. The Dutch settlement mobilized immediately. Some sailors couldn't even crawl from the boat. Their muscle tissue had wasted away so completely that their bodies no longer responded to commands from their brains. Their skin hung in loose folds, their eyes sunk deep into skull-like faces. "I have treated men with every manner of affliction," wrote Dr. Max Winkelmann, the Dutch physician who received them. "But never have I witnessed human beings reduced to such a state who still drew breath. Their survival defies medical explanation." The men received careful feeding, spoon by spoon, hour by hour, as their shrunken stomachs could barely process nutrition. But recovery brought its own agonies. Their bodies, which had begun consuming their own organs for sustenance, rebelled violently against food. Several nearly died during the recovery as their damaged systems struggled to function again. For Bligh, the physical recovery was accompanied by a pressing responsibility, documenting exactly what had happened. Within days of reaching Timor, he began writing a detailed account of the mutiny and their subsequent journey. This documentation would be essential when they eventually returned to England and reported the mutiny to the Admiralty. "I have lost His Majesty's ship," Bligh wrote in his initial report, "but by the greatest miracle, preserved the lives of 18 men who were cast away with me." It would be many months before they could secure passage back to England. Therefore, Bligh purchased a small schooner from the Dutch to begin the journey home. But before they could depart, tragedy struck. The ship's loyal surgeon, Thomas Ledward, who had survived the entire open-boat journey, died from a fever in Batavia, modern Jakarta. The remaining 17 survivors were eventually separated as they found different ships bound for England. Bligh himself arrived home in March 1790, nearly a year after the mutiny. The news of the Bounty's fate had reached England before him, creating tremendous public interest in his remarkable survival story. "The public fascination was immediate," wrote a contemporary observer. "How men could survive such an ordeal became the talk of London society." Bligh was celebrated for his extraordinary feat of navigation and leadership, but he also faced a mandatory court-martial for the loss of his ship, standard procedure in the Royal Navy regardless of circumstances. The court-martial convened on October 22, 1790. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, the court honorably acquitted Bligh of any responsibility for the loss of the Bounty. The official finding declared, "The loss of HMS Bounty was not caused by any fault, neglect, or error of judgment in Lieutenant Bligh." For the men who had shared that remarkable journey, their bonds remained unbreakable. As one survivor later wrote, "Having faced death together for 47 days, we became more than shipmates. We became brothers in the truest sense." They had accomplished something that naval experts deemed impossible, a 3,618-mile journey in an overloaded launch with minimal provisions, navigating without charts through some of the world's most challenging waters. Their survival represented not just extraordinary seamanship, but the triumph of human will in the face of overwhelming odds. The survival journey of Captain Bligh and his loyal crew resonated far beyond their immediate time. The Admiralty recognized Bligh's exceptional achievement with a promotion to commander, but the controversy surrounding the mutiny would follow him throughout his career. The British Navy was determined to bring the mutineers to justice. They dispatched HMS Pandora to search for the Bounty, but the ship wrecked on the Great Barrier Reef in 1791. Ironically, the very obstacle Bligh had skillfully navigated during his open-boat journey. 14 mutineers were eventually captured, 4 drowned in the Pandora wreck, and 3 were exonerated at court-martial. The remaining 7 were convicted, with 3 ultimately hanged at the yardarm of HMS Brunswick on October 29, 1792. The aftermath of the Bounty mutiny had far-reaching cultural impacts. It inspired numerous books, films, and scholarly works examining the complex relationship between leadership, authority, and the human spirit. The story transcended maritime history to become a powerful metaphor for human endurance and the complex nature of leadership under extreme conditions. For Bligh, personally, life carved a path of brilliant achievements shadowed by recurring disaster. He rose spectacularly through the ranks, commanded ships in major naval battles, and eventually reached the prestigious rank of Vice Admiral. But a strange curse seemed to haunt him. In 1808, while serving as governor of New South Wales, he faced the Rum Rebellion, becoming the only Australian governor in history to be overthrown in an armed coup. "Twice deposed by mutiny," one newspaper wrote. "Perhaps no man in British history has inspired such loyalty in some and such violent rejection in others." The men who survived the launch journey with Bligh carried its mark forever. Their bodies never fully recovered. Sunken cheeks, premature aging, recurring nightmares. What wounds weren't visible physically manifested in their minds. Samuel Hayward, who had been just 17 during the ordeal, would wake screaming about water for the rest of his life. John Fryer, the Bounty's master, who had sometimes clashed with Bligh aboard the Bounty, stood firm at the mutineers' court-martial. When asked about Bligh's conduct during their survival journey, he silenced the courtroom. "I have served on 27 vessels under many captains." Without Bligh's leadership, not one of us would have lived beyond 2 weeks. What he achieved was not just rare, it was impossible. He turned dying men into survivors. In the centuries since, Bligh's open-boat journey has been studied by maritime experts, survival specialists, and leadership scholars. Modern analysis has only deepened appreciation for what they accomplished. So, by any standard of seamanship, what Bligh achieved was extraordinary, concludes a modern naval historian. To navigate 3,618 nautical miles with such limited tools through largely uncharted waters represents one of the greatest feats of practical navigation in history. Beyond navigation, Bligh's approach to resource management and psychological leadership has been recognized as remarkably advanced. His strict rationing system, maintenance of discipline, and understanding of group psychology created conditions that maximize their chances of survival. Modern survival courses taught to military personnel, sailors, and pilots often reference Bligh's journey as a case study in effective leadership during crisis. His methods of maintaining morale, creating achievable goals, emphasizing shared identity, and providing psychological structure through naval discipline are now recognized as textbook examples of survival leadership. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Bligh's achievement was navigating the psychological journey as skillfully as the physical one. By maintaining hope and purpose among his men, he created the essential mindset needed for survival against impossible odds. As one of the survivors later wrote, "It was not merely that Lieutenant Bligh knew where we were and how to reach safety, though this was essential. It was that he never permitted us to believe, even in our darkest moments, that we would not succeed." For modern audiences, the story of Bligh's journey offers timeless insights. It demonstrates how leadership, technical skill, and psychological understanding can combine to achieve what seems impossible. It reveals the extraordinary capacity of humans to endure when properly led and unified in purpose. The launch boat used in this remarkable journey was eventually returned to England, where it was displayed as a testament to an almost superhuman feat of survival. Though it no longer exists today, detailed plans and replicas preserve the physical dimensions of the vessel, a stark reminder of just how small and vulnerable their craft truly was. While Fletcher Christian and the Bounty Mutineers have often captured the popular imagination, it is perhaps William Bligh's extraordinary 3,618-mile journey that represents the more remarkable achievement, a testament to human endurance, leadership, and the will to survive against all odds. If this extraordinary survival story captivated you, there's much more to discover about the aftermath of history's most famous mutiny and other incredible feats of human endurance that defy explanation. Share this video with anyone fascinated by survival psychology, maritime history, or stories of human resilience pushed beyond all limits. And tell me in the comments, if you had been in that launch boat with Bligh, what do you think would have broken you first? The physical suffering, the psychological torment, or the crushing uncertainty of never knowing if salvation lay beyond the horizon? Until next time, remember the words of Lieutenant Bligh himself. Adversity introduces us to ourselves in ways comfort never could.